In this lecture, we'll be looking at the life, the work, and the philosophy of François-Marie Arouet, better known to scholars today as Voltaire. He was one of the most significant and influential of philosophers of the European Enlightenment in the 18th century. Voltaire was one of the most influential writers of the 18th century, and he composed hundreds of published works. He's also well known for his voluminous correspondence with over 20,000 letters that have survived. Voltaire's published works range from light verse to epic poetry, and he wrote in such varied genres as narrative fiction, drama, history, scientific treatises, and philosophical works. The image on this slide is of a painting of Voltaire by French artist Nicolas de Lagière, depicting Voltaire in his mid-20s. As an adolescent, Voltaire attended Louis le Grand, a Jesuit school in Paris. He came from a fairly wealthy family, though not from the nobility, and initially at the school, Voltaire experienced some class-based culture shock. At the time, the institution employed some of the most renowned teachers in Europe, and today it's still one of the best schools in France. Most of Voltaire's fellow students were children of French nobles, and he made connections there that helped him throughout his life. Arouet adopted the name Voltaire in 1718. The name is an anagram of Arouet-Ly, the Latinized spelling of his family name, plus the initial letters of Le Jeune, or the younger. So it'd be Arouet the Younger. This is a sort of transposition of the letters. In the same year, Voltaire enjoyed his first literary success with his tragedy Oedipus. From this point forward, Voltaire enjoyed fame throughout European literary and aristocratic circles. In response to some verses attributed to him that were critical of members of the royal family, Voltaire spent 11 months in the Bastille. He may or may not have written the verses, but they were certainly in the style of Voltaire, and probably something that he would have agreed with, but there is some dispute as to whether or not he actually composed the writing that got him sent to prison. While incarcerated, he composed one of his most famous works, the epic poem L'Enriage. Voltaire composed the poem in honor of King Henry IV, or Henri IV of France. In the work, Voltaire attacked religious fanaticism and the resultant civil wars that plagued France for the second half of the 16th century. Some readers at the time also believed the poem was a thinly veiled critique of King Louis XV of France. This poem helped further launch Voltaire's career, and while the poem did not turn out to be one of Voltaire's most enduring works, it nonetheless received a very wide audience. However, just as he became known throughout Europe, Voltaire suffered disgrace and incarceration again, and was eventually exiled to Great Britain. In 1726, Voltaire had made a snide remark to a young noble from the house of Rohan Chabot, who resented that Voltaire made him look like a fool. The crest of arms of the noble's family is depicted on this slide. To get even, the noble paid thugs to give Voltaire a serious beating while he watched. The angry Voltaire took some fencing lessons and challenged the noble to a duel, but he was refused in the duel because he was a commoner and not a noble. Even worse, the young noble's family had Voltaire arrested and taken to the Bastille, where he remained for a short period, eventually being released from prison after promising he would leave France and go to England. The discouraged Voltaire traveled to England, and his influential philosophical letters, also known as Letters on the English, was based on his observations while he lived as an exile in Great Britain. Voltaire described and implicitly praised English religious toleration and English culture. In the work, Voltaire extolled Newtonian physics over Cartesian physics. To Voltaire, the culminating achievement of Bacon's method and Locke's epistemology was Newton's empiricism. Empiricism being the idea that all things originate from experience, that all concepts are about or applicable to things that can be experienced, or that all rationally acceptable beliefs or propositions are justifiable or knowable only through experience. Upon his arrival back in France, Voltaire published the Philosophical Letters in 1734. He did not think there was anything controversial or problematic about the work. However, his reputation did precede him, and French critics denounced Voltaire. They claimed he was promoting Protestant denominations such as the Quakers, or that he was undermining Catholicism, or even that he was attacking God. Church and secular officials were angry and called for Voltaire's arrest. In part, I think some of the anger was fueled, again, by that anti-Cartesian, pro-Newtonian examination of the physics, which Voltaire was looking at a scientific level. But Descartes was a French physicist. Newton was an English physicist, so there was a bit of nationalism, I think, involved. Because of the fear of prosecution and persecution, Voltaire remained exiled from Paris until 1778, the year that he died. It was during this latest exile that Voltaire began a long-standing relationship with a woman of great intellectual achievement. Madame Émilie du Châtelet was one of the leading followers of the theories of Isaac Newton at the time. She was born into an upper-class family in Paris, but in 18th century France, of course, women were excluded from most educational realms. Du Châtelet instead hired professors to teach her math and science. Throughout her scientific career, Émilie du Châtelet engaged in sophisticated scientific inquiry, even translating Newton's Principles of Mathematics into French. She also mastered philosophy and engaged in critical analyses of both the Old and New Testaments, and she was the one who introduced Voltaire to textual analysis of the Bible. It appears that Émilie du Châtelet and Voltaire had a romantic relationship, but theirs was much more than just physical attraction. They were they seemed to feed off each other in an intellectual sense as well. Émilie du Châtelet remained married to her husband during the time that she and Voltaire had their relationship for about 15 years, and she had other lovers as well during the time, but very powerful intellectual synergy that was happening there at the chateau at Cicéret, near the Swiss border. After the death of Madame Châtelet, Voltaire moved to Potsdam, which is located in modern-day Germany. He began to work for Prussian King Frederick II, who would later be known as Frederick the Great. Here's an image about 20 years after the fact depicting the two exchanging conversation. The two had been very close friends and engaged in significant intellectual discourse, but eventually Voltaire and Frederick had a falling out over some satire that Voltaire had penned. Voltaire has been called by some to be the world's greatest letter writer, and while that might be a bit of hyperbole, he did establish correspondence with many of the notable people of the world of his time period, including monarchs, including philosophers, scientists, government officials. Several of the letter-based relationships encompass several decades, including with such figures as Catherine the Great of Russia. And some of these exchanges number into the hundreds of letters with some individual correspondence. The Lisbon earthquake of November 1st, 1755 stunned Voltaire and significantly affected European intellectual life. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives during the tragedy. Some estimates suggest maybe as many as 100,000, which is one of the deadliest earthquakes in human history. Voltaire, like many people, questioned how the devastation produced by nature could be reconciled with the benevolence of God. In his poem on the Lisbon earthquake, or poem on the Lisbon disaster, Voltaire maintained that evil and tragedy are a real phenomenon and beyond human comprehension. And he noted that instead of trying to understand God, we ought to devote our energies to reducing human suffering. Voltaire seemed to be fixated on the Lisbon earthquake for a number of years. The word optimism was coined in the 18th century to describe a philosophical position most famously developed by the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, or Leibniz, Leibniz. But unlike modern uses of the term optimism, the philosophical optimism referenced in Candide, as posited by Leibniz, was based on the idea that the world was created by a perfect God, and since the world was created by this perfect God, this must be the best of all possible worlds. This is the optimist position, and it comes from the Latin word optima, meaning best. So the best of all possible worlds was the philosophy of Leibniz. Voltaire, who was originally an admirer of Leibniz, wrote Candide to attack what he saw as a foolish philosophy. There are also a number of barbed witticisms directed at Prussian King Frederick II in the book. In the text, Candide is a student of a foolish philosopher named Pangloss, whose Leibnizian philosophy appears futile and irrelevant and even absurd in the midst of human pain and suffering. It's actually quite a funny book and rather a short read if you get time to look it up on the internet. But Candide goes through a series of misadventures and tragedies to move from the position, sort of the doe-eyed, naive position of that the world is at the best of all possible worlds, to facing the reality that there's a lot of harshness and evil and pain and misery in the world. In the end, Candide offered up the following advice: let us cultivate our garden. Through Candide, Voltaire concluded that the only remedy to dealing with earthly misery is hard work with an eye toward improving the world. Candide represented a decisive turn away from the religious and metaphysical emphases of the previous millennia and a half to a concern for humanity. And Voltaire's focus was much more devoted to pragmatic activism than to abstract philosophy. This shift from theological and metaphysical problems to seeking ways to improve the human condition is one of Voltaire's principal offerings to the Enlightenment. As a consequence of Voltaire's dismissal of philosophical optimism, it became acceptable for scholars and philosophers to repudiate abstract philosophical thought by arguing that such an approach had little to do with human experience. Theology was no longer the center of intellectual inquiry, and in its place was a movement that promoted exploration into the roots of human despair, as well as encouraging study into methods that could eliminate the factors that prolong injustice or misery. Yet Voltaire, for all his forward thinking, was still a product of his times, and his writings occasionally contain rhetoric that at least by 21st century standards, would be considered racist and/or anti-Semitic. Voltaire, despite his faults, should be viewed as a gifted writer who tirelessly fought for individual liberty, including such ideas as the right to a fair trial and freedom of religion, and as a person who directly challenged the traditional social and political order in a way that no one else had at his time. This draws to a close our brief look at the life, work, and philosophy of Voltaire.